The latest news of the day. COVID variants likely to dent Philippine recovery. The Philippines is facing a stuttering economic recovery due to the sluggish pace of its vaccination campaign and the emergence of more infectious coronavirus disease 2019 variants, Fitch Solutions Country Risk and Industry Research said. In a note sent on Wednesday, Fitch Solutions said it cut its 2021 gross domestic product or GDP growth forecast for the Philippines to 4.2% from the 5.3% penciled in last May, citing the reimposition of a hard lockdown in Metro Manila and the spread of the Delta variant. The revised forecast is lower than the government's 6 to 7% GDP growth target this year. The think tank's downgraded forecast came a day after the statistics agency reported the Philippine economy exited recession after GDP grew by 11.8% in the second quarter. The economy will face continued disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic given its slow pace of vaccinations and difficulties containing outbreaks, it said in a note. Fully vaccinated individuals only make up 10.74% or 11.614 million of the population based on data from Johns Hopkins University. This is still far from the government's target to vaccinate 70 million or the entire adult population by end of this year to achieve herd immunity. Fitch Solutions noted that the Philippines remains a long way off from rich herd immunity such that it can ease preventive measures from significantly. Metro Manila and nearby provinces are under an enhanced community quarantine or ECQ until August 20 as the government tries to curb the spread of the more infectious Delta variant. The Health Department on Wednesday reported 12,021 new COVID-19 cases, bringing the active cases to 81,399. Fitch Solutions warned that the latest lockdown will likely weaken household consumption growth. We have lowered our forecast for household consumption growth to come in 3.5% in the 2021 from 4.0% previously, following a contraction of 7.9% in 2020 given subdued retail activity, it said. While retail activity was already weak before the lockdown, Fitch Solutions said the new surge in cases will dampen the improved consumer sentiment in the second quarter. The think tank said the recovery in remittance inflows may be reflected through higher savings or used by families to offset lost income instead of boosting consumption. Even with a new lockdown, Fitch Solutions does not see significant fiscal stimulus in the second half, noting the government balances debt concerns with supporting growth. However, the government is also conscious of the weakening foreign investor sentiment towards its bonds and is wary of increasing spending further. We expect the lockdown measures to hurt government revenues but also delay expenditure plans, with budgeted expenses not fully utilized by the year end. As such, we have revised down government consumption growth from 7.0% to 5.0%. Fitch Solutions estimates the fiscal deficit to reach 7.8% of the GDP this year, which is slimmer than the 9.3% budget gap projected by economic managers. In the first half of 2021, fiscal deficit was at 716.1 billion pesos, 30% lower than the 1.18 trillion pesos program for the period. However, government spending reached 2.206 trillion pesos, 9.56% short of its 2.44 trillion pesos target for the first half. For 2022, Fitch Solutions expects the economy to grow by 6.8%, lower than the previous estimate of 6.9%. It noted the rebound next year will most likely be backed by base effects when restrictions measures are relaxed. We temper our outlook on two factors. Firstly, we now expect fiscal support to be reined in more aggressively once the economy is on a more sustained recovery path, so that the government can begin reducing its public debt load, Fitch Solutions said. Secondly, we believe the rebound in household consumption could be tempered by the leveraging and weakened household balance sheets. Business groups call for urgent climate change response. At least a dozen business and advocacy groups have called on the Philippine government to regulate vehicles and expand clean energy use in response to a United Nations or UN warning about the irreversible effects of climate change. The UN called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or IPCC report, which warned that the planet could pass the critical global warming limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius within 2 decades as a code red for humanity. In a statement from Green EDSA movement, our country is one of the most affected by climate change, with more record-breaking intense heat and drought during the dry months, unrelenting rains and stronger typhoons during the monsoon season, with widespread flooding in and outside city, and rising level causing many coastal areas in our country to disappear. The Green EDSA movement, supported by several business groups, is calling on government to strictly implement a national transportation policy that would prioritize people mobility over vehicle mobility. The group said, "We call on President Rodrigo Duterte to issue an executive order to all relevant agencies to abide by the implemented 2017 National Transportation Policy of NEDA and direct the Climate Change Commission to coordinate and ensure the implementation of the above climate change mitigating measures." It also urged the government to regulate private vehicle volume on the roads to reduce air pollution and traffic congestion. The group said that the Philippines must join a global shift to clean energy vehicles, increase the use of green electricity generating plants, and expand a public park system. Metro Manila and other highly urbanized areas should also be decongested by moving national government offices to the new Clark Green City, it added. Business organizations that have signed the statement include the Bankers Association of the Philippines, Employers Confederation of the Philippines, Financial Executives Institute of the Philippines, Makati Business Club, Management Association of the Philippines, the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the Philippine Retailers Association, among others. The Green EDSA movement also made recommendations for specific government agencies, asking that the Metro Manila Development Authority to widen sidewalks and bike lanes, charge congestion fees on cars with too few passengers, and intensity efforts against smoke-belching vehicles. The Department of Transportation is being urged to shift high-capacity commuter buses and expedite improved commuter connectivity between trains and buses. It also said the Department of Public Works and Highways should remove obstructing structures that create traffic choke points. The Green EDSA movement added that the Energy Department should increase green electric power generating plant use, with the Environment Department should be stricter when approving permits to cut trees for road widening. The group said the bountiful natural endowments of our country are being despoiled by uncontrolled human developments. For instance, Manila lost its scenic bay shore, Rojas Boulevard, that could have extended beyond the Baclaran to Cavite because of the land reclamation development. The UN asked nations to join the Net Zero Emissions Coalition and prevent the creation of new coal plants after this year. In a statement earlier, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, "The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk." Coronavirus takes its toll on mental health as Filipinos battle stress, anxiety. James B. Santos, not his real name, 24 years old, was diagnosed with a general anxiety disorder in December amid a coronavirus pandemic. He said in an email, "Seeing so many of my friends getting sick from the coronavirus was scary. The lockdown made me feel tired and anxious about what's going to happen to me. I'm not taking medication to control my condition." At least 3.6 million Filipinos suffer from one kind of mental, neurological, and substance use disorder, the health department had said, citing a study by the World Health Organization or WHO. The WHO said in a statement last month as experts and leaders sought action on pandemic-linked anxiety and stress. The mental health impact of the pandemic will be long-term and far-reaching. Everyone is affected in one way or another. Patients with mental health disorders are 2 times as likely to die from COVID-19, according to a study published in JAMA Psychiatry last month. Bernard B. Argamosa, Program Director at the National Center for Mental Health, said they have been receiving more distressed calls at their hotline during the pandemic that has infected 1.65 million and killed almost 30,000 people in the Philippines. When the hotline started in May 2019, the average callers in the first 6 months hit as many as 400. During the first few months of the lockdown that started in March last year, the number of callers doubled to as many as 700 a month, he said. This further increased by 5 times in the third quarter of last year. With about 1,400 calls a month, Mr. Argamosa said it peaked at 1,600 calls in March. Suicide-related calls also accounted for a third of the calls this year, up from 10% when the hotline started. A study by mental health firm Mind Nation released in June found that 53% of Filipino workers had experienced mental health challenges during the global crisis. These include fears about getting infected with the coronavirus, financial pressures, personal problems, work pressure, and trying to juggle work and family matters. According to the report, it added that almost half of the employees feel they have too much workload. Now that the boundaries between personal life and work are blurred with people working from home, employees are working more than they did pre-pandemic when they were on-site with colleagues. Mind Nation, which conducted the study in September 2020 to April 2021, found that workers were lacking focus and concentration and felt they no longer enjoyed things that made them happy in the past. They also had low self-confidence and had a hard time sleeping. The study also found that 13% of workers took a leave of absence due to mental health problems, while 35% had productivity issues, losing an average of 2 hours daily. A quarter of those polled said they were thinking about quitting their jobs. It also said these mental health and well-being challenges cost companies 7 million pesos a year for 10,000 employees. Abnormal conditions. Cornelio G. Banaag, Vice President of the Mental Health Association of the Philippines Incorporated, said the request for appointments during the lockdown increased, mostly concerns about depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, difficulties in school, lack of motivation, and parents getting upset. Mr. Banaag traced most mental health problems to uncertainty and social isolation. Many Filipinos have had to endure being away from their families, relatives, and friends once they get infected with the virus. Mr. Argamosa said people should not forget to go back to the basics, including following health protocols and cultivating relationships with families and friends. He said Filipinos are known to be resilient, and hope would help them cope during the health crisis. Spirituality could also help them survive the pandemic. The speedy rollout of vaccines could ease the anxiety of people. To cope with the pandemic, people should take care of their physical well-being, which is the foundation of good mental health. Aside from getting at least 6 hours of sleep and eating healthy food, creating new routines which were taken away from them during the lockdown would help them deal with stress. He also said that the mind is our best ally, but it can also be our worst enemy. People should avoid negative thoughts and feed the mind with positive thinking. Mr. Santos mentioned at the outset said he tries to deal with anxiety by getting behind the wheel and taking a time off. He also practices breathing exercises, avoids overthinking, and take things one step at a time. But when help is needed, one should seek help, professional or otherwise, he said. TUFC 7.4% GDP growth in 2022. The government is expecting the economy to grow by at least 7.4% under a no-lockdown scenario in 2022. But unemployment and poverty rates will likely remain high, the Finance Department said. With the resurgence of domestic economic activity, the country's real GDP or gross domestic product may return to pre-COVID-19 levels by 2022. In the base case scenario, it is expected that the real GDP will grow by 7.4% in 2022, the Department of Finance said in an economic bulletin. The government set a 7 to 9% GDP growth target for 2022, which the Department of Finance said will be achieved with proper management of risk brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and a calibrated gradual reopening of the economy, but with strict adherence to the minimum public health standards. Even with a generally positive outlook on economic growth, the DOF said unemployment and poverty remain to be major challenges next year. The unemployment rate will likely remain high at around 6.7 to 7.6% next year. This is lower than the all-time high jobless rates of 10% in 2020, but still above 2019's 5.1%. Poverty incidence may gradually improve, but further measures are needed to reach the original target of 14% by 2022, which include transfers to the bottom 50% of the population, the DOF said. While acknowledging the need to extend cash aid to the poor, the DOF stressed the need to deliver the delicate balancing act to support the economy without going broke. Furthermore, there will be limits to what a stimulus could be to do given that there are still so many unknowns about the virus and the nimbleness of its mutations, it added. Data showed that the country's unemployment rate hit 7.7% in June, with 3.764 million Filipinos unable to find work. The underemployment rate, or the number of those employed but wanting more work, worsened to 14.2% in June from 12.3% in the prior month. The government released 665.7 billion pesos so far since last year as part of its response to the pandemic, which includes the higher budget for the health sector, 205 billion pesos worth of cash handouts, and the 50 billion pesos wage subsidy program last year, as well as the 160 billion pesos second stimulus package. There have been calls for the third stimulus package worth up to 400 billion pesos to further support the economy's recovery and to minimize the long-term impact of the pandemic, as strict lockdowns are imposed to curb the spread of more infectious COVID-19 variants. Private investments are seen to be a major growth driver next year, with the DOF estimating a 35.4% increase. Under the base case scenario that the government will no longer impose community quarantines in 2022, despite the strong rebound in capital formation, the DOF said expansion in household and government spending will be muted next year. Personal consumption, which accounts for 70% of GDP, is seen picking up by 1.5% this year and inch up further to 2% in 2022, while growth in government spending will likely slow down to 1% next year from the expected 23.8% rise this year. For the three major economic sectors, the DOF said the industry sector is likely to rise by 7.8% in 2021 and by 11.1% in 2022. Manufacturing is expected to grow by 7% and 5% this year and next year, respectively. The services sector is seen to increase by 3.8% in 2021 and by 6.3% next year, while the agriculture sector's growth will inch up by 1.8% this year, followed by a 2.7% uptick in 2022. Latest official data show the economy grew by 11.8% in the second quarter, ending 5 consecutive quarters of decline. This was a turnaround from the 3.9% contraction in the first quarter and the record 17% slump in the second quarter of 2020. The second quarter GDP growth was largely supported by the 75.5% surge in investments, 27% rise in trade, and the 7.2% increase in household spending. However, this was tempered by the 4.9% drop in government spending. The Philippine economy has to grow by at least 8.2% in the second half to reach the low end of the government's 6 to 7% target for the year. That's another competent and responsible reporting of the news from the business world. This is Joshua Carlos for One on One News.